My name is Bhoe, and we're glad you're here. We're glad you're watching and listening to MCTV, Multicultural TV, and U97.5 FM, Multicultural Radio, Hot Like Pepper Radio. We just had a conversation with the Minister of Energy, which we will want to continue, and we'll have other voices on energy so that we can have a balance to the discussion. We had former Minister Kevin Ramnarine last week, I think, or 2 weeks ago, and we will continue to have others. But we want to hear from the Minister of Energy himself about what is happening now, what decisions are being made, how is policy changing, and what does the future look like. Now, understand that energy has been the mainstay of this economy, but it probably cannot continue as the mainstay. We have a serious problem in Trinidad and Tobago in which energy revenues have been very low comparatively, and that has created a deficit situation for successive budgets in this country for a long time. It means that our expenditures cannot continue at the level that we are having now, and it also has serious implications for how we are going to get our foreign exchange, which has now significantly reduced, and which is critical for the continuation of the manufacturing sector and the process of diversification and exports and foreign exchange earnings. So all of those conversations we will continue. So don't think as you watch this show that you are just looking at the Minister of Energy talking about this thing. We are about Trinidad and Tobago, we are about the region, we are about our place in the world. And we are going to try to explore those things, and we are going to be very civil in the manner in which we conduct our engagement and our discussions, but that will not compromise the hard issues and challenges that we are facing as a country. And we are facing hard issues and challenges as a country. And those hard issues and challenges require decision-making of a very, very sophisticated kind and a very strategic kind. And we can't resile from them. We can't shy away from them. We can't avoid them any longer. COVID has made it a desperate situation, and we've got to make some hard choices and hard decisions. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you for staying with us. This is Brighter Morning with Bhoe. We move on now to our next guest, and he is Mr. Somil Trivedi, and I want to take the opportunity to welcome this young man. Somil, Mr. Trivedi, how are you? Good to have you on the program.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay. You are with the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU. Tell us a little bit about how that functions, because you are talking to a different audience here in the United States, what it does, and what triggers its energy, what might trigger its energy.
Sure. So the American Civil Liberties Union is a nonprofit organization that protects the civil rights and civil liberties of all people in the United States. We operate in all 50 states and the territories. We bring lawsuits against the government and other actors who would curtail civil rights, and we lobby the government for changes that would protect people's civil rights.
Okay. You have been working on various things, and you are involved in various issues now. Tell me we can't say a lot, but maybe 2 or 3 things that you are working on or have worked on, and their significance, their value in terms of the civil liberties and human rights issues.
So my focus at the ACLU is on criminal justice reform. The United States Constitution has what's called a Bill of Rights, and that Bill of Rights actually contains multiple protections for people who are accused of crimes by the government, including the right to be free of unwarranted search and seizure, the right to a counsel at their appearances, the right to due process. Right? Many of these are enshrined in the Trinidadian law and law around the world. And what I do is ensure that people who are accused of crimes are protected by the Constitution, by police and prosecutors and jailers and other actors in the executive branch and in law enforcement. So, for example, if a prosecutor in the United States that is favorable to the defendant, that could potentially acquit the defendant, or mitigate their sentence. In the United States, our Constitution requires that the prosecutor voluntarily turn that information over to make the prosecution as fair as possible. Unfortunately, often they don't do that. And so I have to go to court to force that prosecutor to do so, and hopefully make systemic change, forcing all prosecutors to do that, because we want criminal prosecution to be as fair as possible. Another quick example that ties into today's theme is during COVID. During COVID, I brought lawsuits and lobbied the government to protect prisoners from the pandemic, because as we know, people in congregate living settings are at much higher risk of contracting the disease. And obviously, a prison is a place where they cannot socially distance. They cannot protect themselves. And our Constitution, the Eighth Amendment, requires the government to make accommodations to protect those people. Often they don't do so voluntarily, and so I have to go in and sue them to achieve that.
Okay. That gets us into some of the issues we want to discuss today. I want to discuss this challenge that is taking place now of vaccinated and unvaccinated people in the United States, and really the consternation it is causing in the U.S. And often, because we see the U.S. on the news all the time, many countries take example or take their cue from what is happening. So during the pandemic, everybody, I suppose, including the government and government officials in Trinidad and Tobago, would see Dr. Fauci and what was happening and what he was thinking and so on. And these press conferences went on all the time, and we got our cue from that. So I want to ask you something. Explain to me the challenge that is taking place in the United States now with vaccinated and unvaccinated, and its implication for civil rights, civil liberties, individual liberty, and the protection of the society as a whole.
Yeah, it's a very vexing question in the United States, obviously. And it is true that the world takes their cues, for better or worse, from us. And I would love to be setting a better example, but unfortunately, we're not. The trouble with the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated population is that we have, for years, been living in a media and government culture that has been to our citizens. There's no other better way to put it. And those who are unvaccinated typically fall into two camps in the United States. Those who have been fed lies that the vaccination will cause certain side effects or is a government overreach into their autonomy. And then those, particularly Black people and other people of color in the United States, who have been mistreated by their government for so long, including in the area of vaccines. And there's a long and sordid history of the government misusing healthcare to hurt various marginalized communities. And so between those two histories, those two realities for certain groups of people, we haven't been able to break through and achieve the very simple result that everybody should get vaccinated. And of course, in the United States, like in Trinidad and other places, other vaccines are required for entering schools and workplaces. and places of worship, it has become very commonplace to become vaccinated for things like polio and influenza because it saves lives. And it is not an infringement on civil rights and civil liberties. I understand people who say, well, it is my choice, and I have a personal liberty interest in not getting vaccinated. That would be true if the vaccine only protected yourself. Places like the ACLU and elsewhere who are concerned with civil liberties should always be skeptical of a government who is telling you what to do for your own good. But this is not that. The vaccine is something that we do for other people. And when we implicate the collective rights of a country or a world in this case, civil rights and civil liberties considerations wane while public health and collective right considerations wax. And that's where we are right now, trying to explain to people that this vaccine is safe, effective, and not an infringement on your rights in the way that you have been told.
Yeah, what you are saying there is very, very interesting because you are saying that this premier institution dedicated to the protection of civil liberties, human rights, civil rights, etc., that ACLU is taking the position that the public good, the community welfare, has to have greater significance than individual choice for whatever reason in such a situation, because the public cost in many ways, I'm not just talking about money, is much higher. I wonder if you could expound on that a little bit, because that is at the core of the arguments that are emerging in almost every country, and it is emerging as an issue here in Trinidad and Tobago as well.
Yeah, as I said, I am sympathetic to people who are skeptical of government overreach into their lives. That is essentially what the ACLU does. Prevent the government from infringing on your protected individual liberty. That's right. However, there are boundaries and there are reasonable limits on all constitutional rights. Right? You've probably heard the common phrase, "My right to swing my fist ends where your face begins." Right? To live in a civilized society, we have made a social compact with one another, right? Where we all decide the appropriate level, the appropriate balance between individual liberty and collective health. And once again, if the government were to begin telling people that they must take their vitamins every morning because it's healthier for them, we would be the first ones in court telling you, absolutely not. There is no right of the government to do that, and people have a personal liberty interest in avoiding that. However, where there is such an obvious public health benefit, our constitutional law is clear. I think natural law and common sense is clear that the balance tips in favor of public health. And let me say one more thing, that when we have refused to heed public health advice in this way, we end up restricting other liberties. I have a right to witness the goings on of my government. I have a right to petition my government and to walk into the halls of Congress and see what they're doing in my name. If COVID persists, if we have such a pervasive pandemic that I can't even enter the halls of government or properly protest or properly exercise my right to vote because I might die, then those are infringing on my liberty interests as well.
Okay, so again, this is a very important point that you are making here, Somil, and the position that you are taking, I think, is very, very thoughtful, both from the point of view of individual liberty and societal freedom and opportunity to exist, to continue, to persist. So I cannot use the argument, therefore, of my human rights or my individual freedom and liberty in such a way that I then make it impossible for the democratic system and for the perpetuation of society in its democratic form to persist, can I? I mean, it is
No,
not a
that's
reasonable
exactly right.
argument. And you can't take that to court, can you? Or you can
No,
take
you
it
can't.
to court.
People have tried.
Yes, and they have been
That's
shut
right.
down. Is there a
They
supreme...
have been tried.
Go ahead, finish
Go
your
ahead.
point, and I'll ask you after.
I think the pandemic has spurred a raft of lawsuits making exactly the argument that you've made, that I have a personal right, say, not to get vaccinated before going to a public college. I have the right to enter a government building without operating by their standards. These have by and large been shot down. Now, I want to say, in other circumstances, at least in the United States, restrictions have been shot down. You know that in the United States, we are extremely protective of religious liberty, people's right to pray as they feel. And when states and localities put restrictions on the number of people who could attend a church service, for example, our Supreme Court actually did shoot those down as a violation of their First Amendment right to exercise their religion. People can reasonably debate whether the right to physically be in a church is tantamount to their right to exercise their religion. But our courts are constantly trying to create this balance between civil liberties and a functioning society. But by and large, we have decided that all rights, while sacred and worth defending, have reasonable limits, and most challenges to things like mask mandates or soon vaccine mandates will almost certainly be shot down in the name of collective good.
Okay, now, recently the Supreme Court handed down a decision in favor of universities which basically prescribed that students coming back to the campus will have to be vaccinated. And they supported those colleges. There was a large number of colleges that took that position. Are there other Supreme Court decisions that have set precedent for the way business is conducted now in the United States? I'm going to ask you a follow-up question on that, but I want to clarify that first.
Sure. Yes, the Supreme Court has weighed in a couple of different areas, somewhat for better, somewhat for worse. As you know, we currently have a fairly conservative Supreme Court in the United States that is friendly to certain concerns like business and religion, and not as friendly to other concerns like, say, those of criminal defendants. So I just mentioned that places of worship were exempted from many of the COVID-based restrictions, even though places of worship are no different than other congregate settings. But I'll give you an example from my work. We sued a jail in Orange County, California, for failing to protect the people inside a jail from COVID-19, failing to implement social distancing, failing to implement mask mandates. And we have an Eighth Amendment that prohibits cruel and unusual punishment of people in jails and prisons. And yet the Supreme Court deferred to the jailers. They said jails are allowed to make these sort of decisions. We cannot infringe on their sort of expertise in corrections, even though we have a constitutional right to be protected from cruel and unusual punishment. And so there will be more and more of these decisions where courts try to create this balance between the rights of government and business to perpetuate and the rights of individuals. I think, by and large, our Supreme Court has been slightly out of step with our public health needs. Another example is voting. a lot of states and localities made it easier to vote during the pandemic, knowing that especially elderly people and people with disabilities were going to have a tough time voting in person where they could be exposed to COVID-19 or physically driving to a certain place to vote. So they made it easier to vote from home. Our Supreme Court is egregiously aligned against voting rights right now. Why? I don't know. It is about the perpetuation of our democracy. And yet they found many of those COVID-based loosenings on state and local restrictions on voting to be unconstitutional. They sanctioned making it more difficult to vote during a pandemic. This, I think, and this is tied to the broader assault on voting rights, both in the United States and elsewhere in countries that are following our lead. I think this attack on democracy itself has been underwritten by our Supreme Court, using COVID as an excuse, and I think that is shameful.
All right, I'm going to get to that voting rights issue in a minute, but I want to, for instance, I want to focus on this issue of the vaccination and non-vaccinated. The President Biden recently took a position that all federal workers have to be vaccinated. And if they are not vaccinated, then they've got to do the test every so often to come in. Many of the big institutions in the United States are making their position clear. You can come to work as long as you're vaccinated. So they are making that a condition. And many smaller businesses too, in order to function, especially if they deal with a lot of people, restaurants and so on, are trying to have their people vaccinated so that their customers can feel safe and secure when they come in. What is this doing to the issue of workers' rights, let's say, and where? I don't know if you want to touch on this because this is not really your domain, although I know that you are interested enough to know about it and appreciate it and convey your thoughts well. What is the union position on some of these things? You don't have to touch that if you don't want to.
Look, it's an important question. I don't know the collective union position in the United States, but let me say this. Workers have rights. Unionization is important. It has brought us many of the public health protections, like a limited work day and workers' compensation for injury, that have made the United States a leader in many ways in protecting the rights and the safety of workers. However, as we've said throughout this conversation, there is no right, labor-related or otherwise, to hurt other people in your place of business. So once again, there is a balance of rights individually versus rights collectively. And while I 100% support the right of workers to petition for whatever protections they want, including COVID-related protections, it is simply not reasonable for workers to say, I have a right to potentially transmit to you a deadly disease because I don't feel like getting a simple thing like a vaccination or even a test. And so in the United States, there will be no question that a worker-related vaccine mandate will be constitutional, and that President Biden requiring it for federal workers is no different than businesses requiring it for themselves. And I'll take it one step further. I don't think we ought to leave this up to individual businesses. We've done that for a year and a half now, and they have not proven up to the task of making the difficult choice to protect themselves and others. This ought to be a government requirement. It is no different than requiring that people not drink before they drive. It is telling people there are certain things you cannot do to your body because it can hurt other people. It's as simple as that.
Okay, and this is an ACLU position that you think is palatable and amenable to your mandate?
Well, I don't know that this is an official ACLU position because we focus on the civil rights impacts of all of these things. We don't take public health positions, but do I think that public health and civil liberties can be balanced and reconciled? Of course I do.
Yes.
Now, I don't want to pretend that these are easy questions to hash out in all circumstances. There is always a pull and tug between government and individual. I think these are healthy conversations to have. But vaccines have fallen so clearly on the line of public health for so long in the United States and worldwide. The only reason this is an issue is because many bad faith actors in government and media are stoking the wrong-headed belief that there is some sort of civil liberties element to this, and there's just not. And again, I would be the first one to run to court for you if there were, but there's not.
Okay, I understand your position. Well, you mentioned the issue of misinformation, and I know that this is a big issue, especially because of social media and because of the division of media in the United States between right and left and mainstream and extreme. But tell me something. Do you think perhaps that the issue, this particular issue of vaccinations in the United States has been too politicized? I mean, you had the problem, first of all, with whether you should wear masks or not, and that is still an issue. And you have this problem with the vaccination now. You tend to have more Republicans being against vaccination. You tend to have more people on the right being against vaccination. Is it too politicized an issue? Or
yes.
Did the politics come first and then this became an issue in the rush, so to speak?
So, we're seeing eye to eye. What I was about to say is, yes, it has become politicized, but that's merely because our discourse has become so ugly and politicized over the course of years and decades that this was bound to happen. And so I think, and it's not only the media, it's not only government. We have hollowed out our educational system so that people cannot meaningfully distinguish between good information and bad information. And so I think COVID, like in so many other circumstances, exacerbated underlying problems in society, both in the United States and worldwide. And we need to recommit to a collective understanding of what is good for our society as a whole, how to separate the hucksters and the liars from those who are trying their best to keep you safe. And this has become infinitely more difficult, obviously because of people like Donald Trump and his cronies in both government and media. But I do want to sound a hopeful note. The United States, at least, just crossed the 70% threshold of people who have received their first shot. That's getting close to herd immunity. Now, there are pockets of the United States that are falling woefully behind. We still need to vaccinate the entire globe because we are a community. We cannot avoid this. The pandemic does not start at our border, but we're making progress. We're fighting through, we're pushing through the misinformation and getting through to people. It's taken much longer than we thought, but I don't think all hope is lost.
Okay. Now that will get me to a second topic, really, and you raised it earlier, which has to do with suppression of voting and so on. Recently, you've had a situation in the United States where a number of legislatures have gotten into the act of passing laws that would make it more difficult for people to vote. You mentioned the elderly, you mentioned the sick, the vulnerable, etc. before in the context of COVID. But there are those who basically say that this is organized in a way to suppress minority voters as well. So it is not just a thing of making voting hard. It's a kind of appreciation of the dynamics of voter behavior and basically trying to manage the outcome of elections before elections are actually declared. Can you comment on that a little bit from the point of view of which of the states are involved in this kind of thing? What you see as the motivation and what is the politics and the ethics of it?
That's an important question. It may be the most important question of our time right now. The perpetuation of democracy in the United States and maybe also the world depends on what we do now in response to the voter suppression efforts that are going on in not just a handful of Republican strongholds, but across the country in the halls of Congress, and for a period of time before Joe Biden was elected in the White House. What are these voter suppression efforts? They are restrictions on people's ability to safely and easily cast their ballot. So things like restricting the amount of time that people can vote, restricting their ability to register to vote online, restricting the amount of time that they can vote during the day. And you hit on a very important point. All of these measures are surgically targeted at minority communities and other communities that have traditionally had trouble voting on election day, right? Our United States Constitution, for entirely outdated reasons related to farming, has an election day on a Tuesday in November. Obviously, people who depend on an hourly wage or who cannot get childcare will not be able to vote as easily. And obviously in America, through years and years and centuries of systemic racial oppression, those communities also happen to be racial communities, especially Black people in the United States. And so there is no way to get around the fact that primarily Republican legislatures have decided that their message is no longer compelling to voters. And therefore, the only way to retain minority rule in the United States is to suppress the vote of those most likely to vote against them. And in the United States, that includes people of color, young people, and other disadvantaged and poor people. And so they have taken every effort to make it harder to vote for them and easier to vote for their constituencies. There's no other way to say it.
Okay, how do you, I mean, all of these things can happen because of the constitutional structure of the United States, in the sense that within the constitutional framework, states have tremendous amount of rights and power under the Constitution to manage their own affairs. And the federal government has jurisdiction over the nation. But even in that kind of situation, you can have federal laws of a certain type and then state responses that seek to undermine the federal legislation. I mean, is this proving to be a challenge now in the United States at a time when there seems to be such an ideological clash between right and left, and much more difficult opportunity to tread the middle ground of more reasonableness, so to speak?
Yeah, it's a good analogy that you're drawing. Just like earlier we talked about the push and pull between individual rights and collective rights, in the United States we play that out on a macro level by having a federal government and many state governments and a constitution that devolves power to both of those in different areas. However, being a civil libertarian, I have to point out, we have a constitution that is supreme law of the land, regardless of what states do. And there is no question in my mind and in the minds of voting rights advocates that the federal protections for voting trump all of these state legislative efforts to restrict the vote. And only because Congress has failed to act and because Donald Trump and Republicans before him have packed the courts, our federal courts, up and down, including the Supreme Court, with people who are committed to defying the word and spirit of the Constitution in favor of these voter suppressive laws. That's the only reason we have this problem. This is not a legitimate tug between local control and federal control. This is a usurpation of federal power by states and judges that defies our constitutional structure and needs to be fixed immediately.
Okay. Do you think, two issues on federal law. Do you think that notwithstanding what states might do to suppress voter rights and voter opportunities, do you think that the Congress and Senate, as currently configured, can pass a federal law that nullifies a lot of the damage done by states? So that's the first question. And the second question is, do you think that the issue of the vaccination before going to work, so vaccination as a condition of working, do you think that that will go to the federal legislature?
So to your first question, can our Congress pass laws that will supersede these voter suppressive efforts in the states? Absolutely. The only question is whether they will. We have two bills in particular at the federal level that are in consideration right now that will nullify most, if not all, of these efforts. Congress should pass them. And if they won't, because of some misguided fealty to our filibuster, which maybe you know about in Trinidad, but is an arcane sort of procedural rule that requires 60 votes instead of 50 for certain kinds of legislation, including insanely civil rights legislation. If we don't have the will of 60 senators to pass that kind of bill, we need to pass something more narrow. But can Congress do it in the first instance? Of course they can. As to your question of whether vaccination will become a federal requirement, I don't know. It is an important question. I hope it does. But I think what our president is probably hoping is that the combination of persuasion and public health realities will convince states and localities and businesses to do it on their own, at least to the point where we can achieve herd immunity. We're probably never going to get to 100% immunity, but if we get to something like 70 or 80 or 85, then we can at least sleep more soundly. And between the federal government's non-mandatory efforts and businesses and localities finally taking up the baton, I hope we can get there. If we do not, again, I think the federal government has the power to do so, and there aren't significant civil liberties implications for doing that.
Okay, so legislation is probably a last resort, and really incentives and persuasion and so on is really what is happening now. And as you said, 70% of the US population is now vaccinated, for at least with the first dose, so likelihood of about 70% getting vaccinated altogether fully, that will take place. So, but the problem with that, though, is that you have about 5 what you might call non-compliant states. You've lived all over the U.S. I mean, you've lived in Louisiana, you've lived in Texas, you're now in Washington, D.C. You have a sense of how communities operate in different parts of the U.S. What do you think is likely to happen in some of those states? I mean, do we need to have a real crisis to get people to the vaccination point, or what? And will that affect
we have
the
a
rest
crisis.
The what?
I don't think there is any amount in certain places, in certain communities, particularly where governors and other local officials are exploiting the pandemic for political gain, I think there are going to be pockets of people in the United States who remain unvaccinated for totally unfounded reasons based purely on lies fed to them by government and media. This is just the reality that we live in. And we are going to have to rely on businesses and maybe a federal mandate, as we discussed, to get through to those populations and get them vaccinated for the safety of everyone else. Also, we will have to ramp up our global effort. If we are able to vaccinate the global community such that variants like the Delta variant and now the Lambda variant cannot crop up in other places in the world and then come to the United States or come to Trinidad and Tobago, we'll have done a lot for getting us to the herd immunity that we need without trying to mandate it to the 10 or 15 or even 20% of Americans or people around the world who are simply stubborn and won't listen to the facts.
All right, we're going to have to close pretty soon because we have to stop for the news, but I'm glad you raised that global issue because one of the problems in the United States, for instance, people are not taking the vaccines because they are hesitant, they're choosing not to. In Trinidad and Tobago, we had the same situation. We have the same situation, which is that for a long time we had a lot of difficulty. There were many fumbles and dropping of the ball, etc. But eventually, we now have enough vaccines, at least for about vaccination of half of the population. And the hesitancy is beginning to trigger. But there are many countries that have not been 1% vaccinated, 2%, 3%. Do you think that countries like the United States and other industrialized countries have missed the ball in understanding that, look, we've got to vaccinate the whole world, not just where we live? And why has there been this problem? I know that this is not in your domain, and I don't want to throw it in your court, and if you want to sidestep it, that's fine. Because
No, I think it's...
Go ahead.
It's an important question. I think, obviously, during the Trump administration, we took on a wrong-headed, isolationist view of the world in general, right? America First was a disastrous approach to an interconnected world, and it spawned copycats all over the globe, in Brazil, in Hungary, in other places. And all of them, for political reasons, for populist reasons, took on this approach that I can simply take care of my own constituents in my own country, and to hell with the rest of them. And a pandemic is a great way of showing the fallacy of isolationism.
Yes, exactly.
That you cannot do that. You can't do that economically. You can't do that with respect to civil rights. And you certainly can't do that with an airborne pathogen that crosses borders freely. And so thank the Lord that we are turning the corner on that approach and returning to an era where the United States takes responsibility for its global partners and people around the world simply by the fact that they are people. And it happens to be the self-interested thing to do. If the United States and other major industrialized countries help the world get vaccinated as fast as possible, it will not only help the world, it will help the United States, because we won't be at risk of these variants coming and defeating our immunity. So to me, that's a no-brainer. I'm very glad to see our government pledging 500 million doses at first and hopefully more over time. And I call on every country around the world that has the means to do it to help out, so that countries like Trinidad or even countries that are worse off can benefit, so that we can all benefit.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I will ask you to just do two quick things, 10, 15 seconds each. If you had to say something to Trinidad and Tobago, I know you know here and you've been here. If you had to say something to this country, 1.4 million people, small country, etc., about vaccination, what would you say?
I would say that the data is clear, it is safe, it is effective, and it is the best way for you to not only protect your health, but your civil liberties. You can return to the things that matter to you. not only your jobs, your lives, but your right.
Okay, and if you, I'll give you a final word, if you want to say anything as a closing comment, and we'll have to sign off at this point.
Well, I want to say thank you. It was so nice to be here with you this morning and to speak to my adopted home country of Trinidad and Tobago. And I just want to say that we've talked about the push and pull between collective liberty and individual liberty. And I want to say to you that it's not a binary choice, that we should have a constant conversation, both in the United States and Trinidad, about how best to protect people while keeping them safe. And these are not mutually exclusive. So I want to encourage everybody to engage in that discussion all the time.
All right, then. Thank you very much, Somil Trivedi. We're very happy to have you. Somil is an attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union in the United States, and we're very glad that he was here this morning to share his thoughts and his ideas about voter suppression and about human rights and civil liberties under conditions of COVID, where the collective good is dominant. We're very happy that we had this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
You too.
All right. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Now, most of the conversation was about the United States, but it is important to have those conversations. We had a conversation recently about football and about technology, that's to say Twitter and Facebook and so on, in the United Kingdom, in England. And today we're having a discussion about civil liberties and voter rights, etc., in the United States. The world is very interconnected. And the best way you can keep a country dumbed down is to have very limited conversations about your own condition in Trinidad and Tobago, let's say, and to keep out the conversations that are taking place elsewhere so that you are not informed about how other people are thinking about the things that matter not just to them but ultimately to you. And we are going to carry these conversations as we go forward. We'll talk about things in Trinidad and Tobago. We're going to talk about things abroad and how they impact on you as citizens. I want to thank you very much for staying the course with me, for Somil Trivedi from Washington, D.C., and from the Minister of Energy, Mr. Stuart Young, this morning. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and we'll see you tomorrow. Tomorrow we have two important guests. I'll just tell you who they are, if I can find them. Mr. Kelvin Ramkisoon, he is an attorney at law. We will talk about procurement and procurement-related issues. And we'll have Kenwin Jones, former national footballer for Trinidad and Tobago, who played in the United Kingdom. So you'll get a first-hand view of him as a footballer playing for the clubs over there. Okay? Thank you very much for watching. This is Brighter Morning with Bhoe.